Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut, this biweekly conversation virtually, which is a series that features AARP staff and volunteers and decision makers. In our conversation, we discuss a variety of topics affecting Connecticut older residents. Today, we're joined by AARP Connecticut volunteer Pat Lang and State Representative David Arconti. Pat Lang, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do for AARP as a volunteer?
I'm a very eclectic AARP volunteer. I also volunteer for driver safety. I help out with the presentations on electric choice. I also did a presentation last night on livable communities. So I found out that since I've been an AARP volunteer, the more I get involved in, the more I want to be involved in because they do so much good.
Well, thanks, Pat, and thanks for all you do. And we're also joined by our special guest today, State Representative David Arconti. And Representative Arconti, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, what you do for a living, maybe if you do something outside of being a legislature, and tell us a little bit about the district that you represent in the state legislature.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for having me on today. It's always great to connect with you and your members. Yeah, I've been serving in this role. My first election was 2012 when I ran for this seat at the ripe old age of 25. And I've been serving the 109th district ever since. Just won my 5th term back in November, and serving my 2nd term as chair of energy and technology. I love the community I represent in Danbury. I come from a long line of public servants in my family. My great uncle served as mayor of Danbury for 3 terms, 1968 through 1972. My uncle Tom served on the council for a decade in the 90s. My other cousin, Gene Eriquez, was mayor for 12 years. My father retired 4 years ago from a 30-year career with the Danbury Police Department. My uncle Gary, same with the fire department. So I grew up around a lot of public servants. I guess you can say it's in our blood. And when the opportunity presented itself in 2012 to serve in this role, I jumped at it. A little proud of the fact that I'm the first member of my family to serve in state government in the legislature. It's hard to be the first to do anything in the Arconti clan because there's so many of us. But I'll hold on to that mantle as long as I can take it. I don't know if I'll be the last one, but I can always say I'll be the first.
That's great. And I will say that I remember when you first got elected to the legislature, and you've always been one that's been very accessible, willing to meet with AARP staff and volunteers, and we really, really do appreciate that. So you said you're co-chair of the Energy and Technology Committee, and why don't you tell us a little bit about what that role really entails, and then if you also want to maybe tell us what other committees in addition to the Energy and Technology Committee you serve on, although I know you have a lot of work just chairing that one committee.
Yeah, thanks, John. So as chair, the committees work, right? There's a House chair and a Senate chair. Then we have our ranking members from each chamber too, and then vice chairs. As a chair, you're really in charge of the agenda of the committee. The behind the scenes details of drafting legislation, organizing public hearings, committee meetings, making sure our clerk is working well with members of the public like yourselves to make sure you can come and testify at our public hearings, making it as painless as possible. And I just want to give a shout out to the energy clerk, Will Jin, who this is his first year clerking, and he's done a fabulous job of running our meetings and public hearings. And as you said, John, chairing any committee is very time consuming. And I would say chairing this committee is just a little bit extra. I know you've worked on these issues for a long time. And I told someone the other day, unless we're drafting a bill that is directing DEEP or PURA to study an issue, every bill is complicated and hard to draft because the statutes and the language around energy and technology subject matter are so technical. And there's so many, I guess best way to put it is there's vines, when you draft a statute, there's so many connections to other statutes and other programs. that sometimes it just takes extra time, and that, typically our committee, puts out 15 to 22 bills a session out of committee. If you look at insurance or other committees like public health, they put out sometimes 40, 50, or 60 bills. And that's just because of the nature of energy and the complication around it. And the other committees I serve on are the general law committee. A lot of that committee works on kind of the specialty stuff that other committees don't have cognizance over, a lot of consumer protection issues that I know AARP works on as well. So always good to work with this organization on that committee. And this year I asked to serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee. We have a robust veteran community here in Danbury. Our veteran service organizations and VFWs, they're an integral part of the Danbury civic community. And I wanted to kind of get to know those organizations a little better and work with them on some legislation up at the state capitol.
Yeah, I just have to tell you, you've done a great job getting a good grasp on the issues in the Energy and Technology Committee, because as you said, they're so technical in that nature that just a little wording change can give a totally different meaning to things. And, we all know how much of a negative impact that could have on ratepayers of either, electric, gas, water, you name it. So it's really been a pleasure working with you on that committee. So why don't we dive into it a little bit on some of what are the major issues. So, we, as you said, we follow a lot of the issues related to energy and utilities, and we've worked closely with you even before you were chairman on a lot of those issues and issues in general law, as you said. But what are some of your major priorities with the Energy and Technology Committee in 2021? And then we'll kind of go into detail about a few of the ones that we're working on with you. But what are some of your main key priorities this year?
Sure. So, as you know, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little later, we passed a very substantial bill last September in the special session, which has been dubbed the Take Back Our Grid Act. A lot of that bill probably would not have been able to get done during a regular session because of, I don't want to name any special interests, but sometimes it gets very hard to pass those types of reforms unless you really have the public on your side. And we had the public on our side. So the fact that we were able to take a big chunk out of reforming how we do rate making in Connecticut and some other reforms, I don't want to say this year's agenda is light, but my priority is holding the line on policies that are going to have a detrimental impact on rates. I've heard, I continue to hear from constituents, I think all my colleagues would agree, they continue to hear from their constituents on the inability to afford monthly utility bills, especially in a time of unknown that we're in with a pandemic. People are still out of work. They're not sure what work looks like for them in the near future. And so that's my priority, John, is kind of holding the line on some of those things. Connecticut has done a lot on clean energy. Right now, 61% of our load, of our supply is contracted to zero emission resources. Not doing anything by 2025, that number is 91% of our, electric supplies is dedicated to zero emission resources. So, that's why I push back on people who say, Connecticut hasn't done enough. I argue we absolutely have played our role in making sure Connecticut transitions and does its part to address the climate emergency. But there's only so much one state can do on its own. Energy policy really is a regional solution because it all affects, there's the whole transmission system, the distribution system. Nothing is just in and of a state in and of itself.
Right. And Pat, you could tell us as a volunteer who works now virtually within the community, the impact that our members have with higher rates and how they really affect them. So, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how, these things affect our members and our ratepayers.
Well, I've seen I've seen the recent proposal for to Eversource to raise the rates in the summer, which is smack dab, and I was talking to John about this, right smack dab in air conditioning season, in the air conditioning season. My rates are always higher in the summer because I have central air. I have gas heat. So this is going to be a double whammy, especially on people who maybe just be getting back into the job market. Those that have been out, they're going to get hit with not only getting the rates, but higher rates.
Yeah, right. So Representative, your focus on maintaining rates, is really critical, and we appreciate the work you've been doing on that. So, we've worked very closely with you over the years. I can remember way back, when you first got in the legislature, on issues around third-party electric suppliers, and Pat will talk a little bit about it as well after we hear from you. But because she mentioned earlier in her introduction, she does a electric choice presentation. We have volunteers like Pat who go out and help people determine whether or not it's the right thing to choose a third-party electric supplier. And if they decide it is, how to do that in an effective way. But we work a lot with you about curbing the abusive practices of some of the third-party electric suppliers. And, we hear from folks all the time. I know Pat does that we think there needs to be more reform. So what else do you think we need to do, or what could be done to help rein in some of the bad practices of third-party electric suppliers out there?
Yeah, thanks, John. We've been able to reform a lot of the marketing practices, et cetera, through your work with OCC and all the various PURA dockets too that they've taken up on this subject matter. And PURA is a great resource, on this. It's always disappointing to get the data from them on all the fines that they've had to levy over the years on some of the third-party market suppliers, and the reasoning behind the fines, some of the practices that they've used to kind of, I don't want to say dupe, but to get people to sign these contracts. So some of the things we're looking at this year to continue to reform that market, to shift some of that risk away from ratepayers, is one thing our electric supply bill does this year is it gets rid of early termination fees. Right now, if you wanted to get out of a contract, it would cost you $50 to terminate a contract. And some people can't find that money. So they're stuck paying a fixed rate that just jumped up that they were not expecting to happen, and they don't know how to pay a bill, and to get out of the contract is going to cost them more money that they don't have. And I know you've done a lot of work on variable rates, back in the cold snap, polar vortex, what was it, 2013, 2014?
2014, yeah.
Time frame. Then the legislature took some action, and going forward, prohibited these suppliers from entering into variable rate contracts. And we saw again firsthand what can happen to utility bills and rates if you're tied strictly to a variable rate structure in the market in Texas, right? You saw people's bills jump thousands of dollars because their rate, their bill was tied to the market structure of ERCOT. And unfortunately, that can what happens sometimes. So the legislation we have before us would clean up that loophole that allowed grandfathering in of people who are on variable rate contracts after the legislation passed in 2014. So we're looking at getting rid of that loophole. And then also ending the auto renew feature of these contracts. We have data PURA presented at a public hearing with data. It's in my notebook somewhere. I'm going to try to recall it from memory. That I don't want to say the percentage because I don't recall it, but a decent percentage of the people they surveyed were paying, in the ranges of 15, 18, sometimes 20 cents a kilowatt hour for the supply side of electricity for their homes. The standard service right now with the utility is 7-8 cents, I think. Yeah. And then most likely, right, come June, when the next 6-month tranche auction happens at the regional level, the price on the wholesale market is going to go down. So most likely the supply side, if you're on standard service, is going to go down from July through November. But that's not the case if you may be on one of these contracts that auto renews, and then all of a sudden that rate that you signed up for, 5 cents or 6 cents a kilowatt hour, all of a sudden jumps to 10, 12 cents a kilowatt hour, unbeknownst to you.
Yeah, I mean, those are really great reforms, and we certainly, support those reforms and appreciate you taking the lead on them with PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, and OCC. Pat Lang actually does presentations. So Pat, when you're out there, just for the representative and our audience's purposes, making presentations now virtually, because we converted all our community presentations to a virtual format. So we're still reaching out and getting out and to talk to members. But Pat, when you do the electric choice presentation, what are some of the things you still hear about that are happening with folks on these third-party contracts?
Well, a lot of them, I'm sorry. A lot of them we find out they might be on public assistance, and they're being targeted for the for these third-party payers, and they're paying a lot more, which means that the rest of us are also paying this bill. Are paying a portion of this bill. I talked to one woman when we did a live presentation. She showed us her bill. She was paying probably almost double what the standard rate would have been. She had no idea of how she even got it. She thought maybe it was signed by her where she lived. It was
Representative,
apartment house that it was and she has no idea how she got on it. In fact, when a few of us looked at the thing and said she probably could have even paid the $50 and saved money, to get out of this contract. But I've tried to see if someone at the senior center, could sit down and help her, or I asked her if she had a relative who could help her get out of this contract, because she was just being, she was just being used.
Yeah, and so Pat touched up on a lot of things, and I know the bill that you're working on, Representative, with us and others, is going to address a lot of those things, because people are still getting them. And I know there were a couple of representatives who didn't support the legislation in committee who brought up a point, and I think it's an interesting point that should be addressed, which is, they said, well, aren't the number of complaints on suppliers going way down, right? And I remember pointing out, and I actually got asked that question. I remember pointing out the fact is we went from like 60% at the peak of the market of people in the third-party supplier market to like 20% now. And the correlation with the drop, there's been a correlation in the drop of complaints equal to the drop in customers. So there's, yes, fewer number of complaints, but not percentage of those who are actually still in the market. So we really appreciate the work you're doing on that.
When the Wall Street Journal writes a big expose on maybe this market isn't working, I think it's time to take a look if the Wall Street Journal is going down that route.
Yeah, Representative, you're 100% right. And my colleagues in the state of Maryland just passed some sweeping reforms. A lot of them are some of the things we've already done here in Connecticut, and some of them are the things that we're looking at doing in Connecticut, because this is just, it's in Texas, it's in Maryland, and there are, I think, 15 states that have deregulated, and not a single one has since those 15 have, and there's a reason for it. So it's critical. So that's not the only thing that you're working on, but the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown how much people rely on high-speed internet. We wouldn't be able to do this interview right now if it weren't for high-speed internet, but it's also showed the deficiencies that exist in Connecticut. But we rely on our high-speed internet for telehealth, virtual visitations with loved ones, for job growth, remote learning. So, what do you think we can do to address the deficiencies that we still have in the state of Connecticut with regards to access to high-speed internet?
Yeah, so it's the technology side of the community and broadband. We do have a great bill in front of us that Governor Lamont has introduced back in February that the committee has been working on. I think that one is House Bill 6442.
Yes.
And we're still working diligently through that. John, as you just said, both electricity and access to high-speed internet is the lifeblood of the economy, right now. The economy and people's lives really can't work without either of those two. At least modern life as we know it can't work without either of those two. And so we're trying to, increase adoption of high-speed internet access in the urban areas. We're trying to, bring an equity lens, on this issue. We're seeing a little bit of data coming out on how many students, were left behind in a year of virtual learning because of lack of access. And then too, in our rural communities, right, it's, the ISPs, the internet service providers, it's too expensive for them. They don't want to build out in those areas. It's the same arguments that I'm sure were made back in the 50s on, rural electrification. But, at the time, the federal government had to, step in to make sure the utilities at that time built out the electric infrastructure to make sure people in rural areas had access to water and electricity and things like that. And broadband that's our, right, rural electrification, that's our big policy goal now in the times we're living in is, rural broadband, access and making sure rates stay stable and increasing output in the urban areas. And that's the fine line we have to walk, where I'm a little nervous only because that world, the broadband world, right, the regulation is chopped up between state regulation and federal regulation. And I am cognizant on putting a bill forward that, would force build out or force things without having PURA have the ability to regulate rates. So we're still trying to kind of walk that line, figure out how we can, work this with FCC and things of that nature. President Biden has included massive funding proposal for broadband in his infrastructure package. That's fairly new, so we're still kind of combing through that to see how we could draft legislation too in this bill that would complement that investment if it were to pass the Congress and come to Connecticut.
Right, and that's critical. And I mean, Pat, you could tell us, as a volunteer, as a person who's, how critical broadband is or high-speed internet is to our folks.
Oh yeah, we are doing so many virtual presentations now that people need to have the internet to be able to access them. I was recently on a trip out to Sharon, Connecticut, for a weekend, and set my phone and my GPS to get out of the place. I couldn't use it. It just says no access. So I told John I had to wait till I finally got someplace, because several places, I drove a few miles, no access. I finally got a place that had a gas station and a donut shop. I figured they would have Wi-Fi, so I could finally set my GPS.
And it's important, we have our folks that rely on telehealth,
Yeah.
virtual visitations to nursing homes. I mean, all of that stuff is critical. So we understand the balance that you've got and appreciate the fact that you're working, diligently on it. And but Pat, touched upon the issue. It's a critical issue for the areas that don't have it. Affordability is also an issue. But the other thing is, the service providers today have a lot of people convinced that there's absolutely no regulations that the state or the federal government can put into this system, and that's just simply not true. Certain things we can't regulate. We can't regulate rates completely right now. So it's a balancing act, and I don't, I really appreciate the work that you have to balance to kind of get it right. So, so kind of looking away from legislative issues, what are your thoughts about the recently requested rate hike by Eversource? It's a big issue, big topic. What do you think we could do to mitigate that issue? I know you, recently in the last few weeks have been in the news talking about it. So, where do we stand there, do you think?
Yeah, that one is right as complicated as they come. because right, the rates are handled over at Pura. And our hands, listen, as difficult as it is for people to hear, right? The deep in the state entered into a 10-year power purchasing contract with Millstone. It's a state power purchasing contract, which means it's the Connecticut ratepayers who are paying for that for that PPA. And what that PPA does is it tells both Eversource and United Aluminum, you have to buy these electrons that are generated by this generator at 4.99 cents a kilowatt hour. And now, and Millstone's a base load generator, generates 2,000 megawatts of electricity. So that's not, a small number. Now, don't get me wrong. The fact that losing Millstone, we would have lost a baseload generator that's zero emissions. It would have been detrimental to the state and detrimental to the region. But like I've said, time and time again, I did oppose the bill, not because I thought Millstone shouldn't have been saved, so to speak, but it needed to be and still does need to be a regional solution. This is a regional resource. The entire ISO New England grid and ratepayers all across New England are benefited from keeping this resource online, both from an energy perspective, but also from an environmental one, right? Because it's zero emissions.
Absolutely, and we were on the same side of that issue. I mean, we opposed that agreement because it was a state payoff for a regional rate, because Connecticut's power generating emissions aren't just affecting the air around the state of Connecticut. It's a regional issue, and and so it should have been a regional solution, because you're right, it needed to be saved. Our objection was that we were saving it and it was going to benefit the region, and ratepayers in Connecticut who are already overburdened were going to be paying for it. And the other grind on that is now they're going to probably get reimbursed at the federal level too, and we're in this 10-year power agreement, so they're going to get a double dip. And that's through no fault of ours. So, but we appreciate your diligence on it.
And also on kind of the rate, why Eversource keeps going back, for rate increases. I don't know how to say this, but up until recently, there's just always been settlements. Past Pura chairs and Deep just settle rate cases and do these settlements with the utilities instead of going to the mat with the utilities. Maybe instead of doing things through revenue decoupling mechanisms, I would say Deep should just let Pura do its job. If they need to go to the mat, let them go to the mat. And maybe it's time that you just give Pura a chance to look at our ROE instead of, if you can lower the ROE and do it in a way that can't be challenged, then Eversource and UI can't come before Pura and ask for a rate increase to match what Pura said you can legally earn, right? That's the thing that people forget. Pura in the past has said you can earn this much as you're entitled to. And if the utilities under recover on that earning, they get to go to Pura and say, hey, look, you said we could earn this and we didn't this year. Can you please true up through the revenue? It's called a RAM, a revenue adjustment mechanism on people's bills. And that tends to what happens sometimes. So that's why I have such, high regard for Chair Gillette over at Pura, because she does seem willing to do what past chairs haven't done, and that's kind of go to the mat on some of this stuff.
Well, and that leads us to, legislation that you mentioned at the beginning, right? I mean, a lot of you trying to address those issues was done in the Take Back Our Grid Act, as you said, that passed last year in special session after the devastating storms that left a lot of us without power for days. I was lucky. I had a big giant cooler and I filled up with ice, and I came on within 24 hours. And I'm in the UI territory, but there were people in the UI territory near me. My brother just blocks away over the line who was out for 5 days. So it's not necessarily one company's doing a better job than the other, although OUI did probably a slightly better job, but there was a lot in that bill that will address those issues. So why don't you just give us a quick overview of some of the good things that were in the Take Back Our Grid Act that you shepherded and spearheaded?
Yeah, sure. That big utility reform bill. The first couple of sections dealt with a complete reform on how Pure will do rate making going forward after they get through the docket to switch rate making policy. So right now it's a cost of service rate making. Essentially, the two utilities, they come in front of Pura and they say, here Pura, this is how much we need to run the grid reliably and deliver electricity. And more often than not, like Pure in the past had tended to approve that. But going forward, it's now performance based. Pure will have a whole new set of metrics to be able to look at when it comes to rate setting. A couple of them that I think people watching this will be interested in: cost efficiency, affordability, and customer satisfaction. So right now, despite how dissatisfied people are with the service they get by the utility, Pure can't take that into account when it comes to setting rates. Going forward, once they get through the docket to establish the metrics, they can. So the utilities now will have an incentive to actually communicate and make their rates and be cost efficient. And that was another thing we wanted to do, and we did. Previous to the bill passing, Pura had 180 days for a rate case. That was one of the shortest timelines around the country. We upped it to Pura now has 65 days for a whole rate case. I can't tell you how much that's going to have an impact, I think, on Pura's ability to question the utilities, go through like the information that Pure gets is binders and binders full.
Yeah.
Like if you think drafting legislation in the Energy Committee is tough, just try to go through all that information, the numbers and the metrics on a rate case.
Yeah, people have no idea. It's like a court proceeding, and there's evidence and questioning, and yeah, I mean, we've participated. It's amazing.
Yep, and that gives, I think it gives more time too for public comment, right? It gives time to
really, yeah,
do a road show across the state on a rate case now, because they have a whole year instead of
you could get out and have public hearings out in the different communities, which, in the past, we've actually filed motions at some of these rate cases to ask them to do, public hearings out, because we don't get to a lot. So that's a really great bill. I know there's a lot on affordability and dockets on low income rates and things like that. So all things AARP is pushed for, and we really appreciate that. We're coming close to the end. So I want to let Pat Lang ask our final question. So Pat, why don't you ask the final question?
Thanks, John.
Sure.
Representative Arconti, very good hearing you today. COVID has changed the way the legislature is functioning, and of course, it's necessary. Okay, what would you suggest that our viewers do if they want to get involved in legislation and participate in the process?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's tough. It's a tough question to answer, and every legislator is a little different. But I would take advantage of reaching out to our offices by phone and email. We do get quite a bit more email these days than in the past, because people right now can't be in the building. Typically, I know your viewers would always come up and you see the sea of red, and we knew AARP was in the house, and we always wanted to meet with you guys. But take advantage of the structure also of AARP. I know you have a lot of volunteers and community leaders like yourself that know how to get in touch with us. So using the structure of an organization like AARP is also a great way to have your voice be heard in the legislature with your state rep or state senator. I get those. Those are my couple suggestions on how we can.
And those are great, Representative Arconti. We appreciate it. We appreciate working with you. Any final words for our folks? How do you feel about the end of the session? Anything else you want to impart on us?
Yeah, I gotta watch my language, but it's gonna be crazy.
Yeah.
We're gonna try to get as much done as possible in this remote format, and I'm looking forward to going to events again. Looking forward to seeing the sea of red at the Capitol once COVID is past us and we're able to get a large amount of people back in the building. And looking forward to see everybody out at Danbury events as soon as they can start up again.
Well, we really appreciate. I want to thank Pat Lang, our extraordinary volunteer who's involved in so many of our programs, for doing this. And I certainly want to thank David Arconti of Danbury, chairman of the Energies Legislature and Technology Committee, and someone who's always been a champion of the issues that, not just on energy and utilities issues, that AARP has been working on. So that's all for this morning, folks. We thank everybody for joining us for another morning edition of Coffee and Tea with AARP. Thank you.